For all the love and the comments that were thrown in the first video, I was absolutely compelled to make a second video talking about 10 more awesome pivot table tricks. Now these are absolutely hand-picked tricks, very rarely known, but incredibly helpful. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this video as well. No further ado, let's begin with pivot table tricks. Let's go. Alright, let's just start with the first one. This one is a bit of a case study and I would want you to solve this along with me. Let's just say we get the data something like this. On the rows here we have the products, and on the columns here we have the months, and in between we have the units as sales. And somebody comes and tells you that I would want you to make another pivot table or another summarization for me, and it should look something like this. So here I would want to summarize by the year. In the year, I would want to summarize by the quarter, and I just want to take a look at the units. In case you think that you would be able to make a pivot table from this data, you would not. Let me show you why. So I'm just going to maybe select the data, and I'm going to maybe start to trigger off a pivot table from here. On a new worksheet, I make a pivot table. And as soon as I start to make the pivot table from this data, you're going to find that the columns have been converted into months right here, the columns right here, and there is no chance that I can drag every single column into rows or columns, and I can just maybe have the values presented. This is because the data is already in the pivoted format. Now here is one thing that I would recommend you to watch in your data. Whenever you get cross-tabulated data sets, you are absolutely screwed. What do I mean by cross-tabulated? If I want to understand the number 35, I have to take a look up and I have to take a look at left to understand the meaning of 35, that it belonged to the month of Feb and it belonged to product B. Whenever you have cross-tabulation, looking up and looking on the left, you're generally screwed. Now, how do you correct this data? Because unless you correct the data, you would not be able to make a clean pivot table. Of course, there are ways around it, but you'd not be able to make a pivot table. So we're going to use a pivot table to correct the data and then make a pivot table on top of it. So we're going to trigger the old pivot table wizard, which was available in Excel 2003. How do you do that? Select the data, and I'm going to trigger the pivot table using a shortcut, because from here you trigger the new pivot table, but I'm going to trigger the old pivot table wizard, and the shortcut for that is Alt-D-P. D for Delta, P for Peter. And then I say, hey, I want to consolidate multiple ranges, click on next. I will create a page field, click on next. It asks you for a range of data. Of course, I can just provide the range of the data, which is all of this data. Click on add next. And then on the new worksheet, I'm going to add a pivot table. Now you're going to see that from the pivot table that we started with and the pivot table that we have received, we've gotten to the very same format. Nothing has changed as of now. But guess what? Double clicking on the pivot table gives you the detail of that value, and that's exactly what we are going to do. If I just maybe double click on the grand total right here, this is going to give me the detail, and that is where the data has come absolutely corrected. So the first one is nothing but our product, the second one is nothing but our month, and the third one is nothing but our units. And if you were to make a pivot table from this data, you can probably make any sort of pivot table because there is no more cross-tabulation in the data. You could read the data of a single row itself. That is pretty damn awesome. All right, let's just start with trick number 2. I call it the data distribution trick. What do I mean by that? Take a look. I have a simple pivot table, which is where I have the years, the month, the revenue, and the by today revenue. In case you do not know about by today revenue, I highly recommend that you take a look at one of the previous videos that I have done on pivot table tricks talking about this technique. Any which ways, in this pivot table, I have also kept the sales rep in the filters right here so that I can apply a filter to any particular sales rep. Let's just do that for a quick second. I'm going to maybe apply a filter to Bruce, click on OK, and this pivot table now only shows me the data for Bruce. But let's just say that my boss comes in and he says that, hey, why don't you make a pivot table for every single sales rep which is there in the filter? That means I have to then copy the data, apply the filter for Abhay, Anshika, Bruce, Charlie, James, so on and so forth, one after the other, and that would create like a lot of sheets. But that is going to be a lot of manual work, copy pasting and things like that. Is there a way to automate that? Sure enough, there is. So I'm going to go ahead and first off, since I want to make multiple sheets for sales representatives, I'm going to take the sales rep, put that in the filter section of the pivot table so that I can take a look at the sales rep right here. Now, once I do that, I'm going to go over to the pivot table analyze tab. In the options drop down, I'm going to say that show report filter pages. This is essentially means that I'm trying to create a page for every single value which is there in the report filter. So I'm just going to click on that. It says, do you want to make a page for every single sales rep? Sure enough, I do. Now, once I do that, please take a look at the pages that I have. And as soon as I click on OK, I'm going to get a page for every single sales rep that I have. And that is absolutely incredible. Now, in continuation of the second trick, which is distributing data across the pages, if you would have a certain, sales rep selected right here by choosing multiple selections right here, then the pages would have been created only for the selected items and not for all the sales reps. That's one sub trick that I'm talking about. Now, let's just say that you are maybe not interested in creating multiple pages right here. You are, however, interested in creating multiple Excel files where this data can be labeled as Abhay, and Abhay is one Excel file, Anshika is another Excel file, so on and so forth, and you would want to email those files to everybody else. Now, you can't really do that using a pivot table, but you can use a very, very simple macro for that. And I just Googled it. I found a very nice macro to do that. I'm just going to maybe copy that particular code. I'm just going to select that code, Control C. Of course, I'm going to give you that code and also the link to that code, which shares a couple of more techniques of improvising on this macro. Any which ways, I'll say, hey, I want to copy this. I'm going to go ahead and trigger my VBA window. I right click on any of the sheets, click on view code. That opens up the VBA window. Inside of the VBA window, I'm going to click on insert a module, like a blank page for writing my VBA, paste my code right here. And as soon as I click on the play button, this is going to create multiple Excel files in the folder, which is where my source Excel file is. I'm not going to do that at the moment, but this is what it is going to do. And you can then take out all these files and send it off to anybody whom you would like to send. That's awesome. Trick number 3, one of the most irritating things in the pivot table is that it adjusts the size of the column automatically as the pivot table refreshes. I hate it. Let me show you what do I mean. So let's just say that at the moment I have sales rep in the pivot table. I cancel out the sales rep, maybe I bring the customers in, and you're going to see that the column width automatically has changed to fit the largest customer, which is kind of helpful, but kind of also irritating a lot of times, because in case you're trying to build a dashboard and the cell widths change, the entire structure of the dashboard is going to start looking weird. So how can I fix the width of the column that no matter how I change the pivot table, the width of the column never changes? Simple enough. I'm going to right click on the pivot table, go to pivot table options, and right here I'm going to say, hey, stop to do auto fit. So I uncheck that, click on OK, and now the column width is never going to change. All right, fellas, trick number 4, pivot table custom grouping. Take a look. Simple pivot table, years, customers, and the revenue. And I would like to define a custom grouping for my customers. For some or the other reason, I group the customers in a certain way, or I would want to show them in a certain way. How do I do that? I'm going to maybe select the customers that I would like to group together. Right click on that, and I'm just going to call this as a single group. They are going to be formed in a native label of a group 1, but sure enough, you can change that label to something else as well. I'm going to call this group as big customers and then select the rest of them. Once I've selected the rest of the customers, I'm going to right click on that and make another group for that. And I'm going to call these as maybe small customers. So maybe I can just change that label to small customers. And now what I have been able to do is across my entire years across the pivot table, I have been able to create 2 groups, big customers and the small customers. Sure enough, you can also label this as a more customized label. Rather than calling this as customers 2, I'm going to call this as customer category. And guess what? You can only start to now use the customer category. So I can probably get rid of the customer itself, and I can just show big customers and small customers across the years in my pivot table throughout any kind of cuts and slices that I would want to see. That's pretty awesome. Trick number 5, showing the calculation in rows rather than in columns. Take a look, this is pretty interesting. Now let's just say that those big customers and small customers are the customers that I have dragged in my pivot table right here. I have a year filter on the top. I'm going to apply a filter of 2007, and I take a look at various calculations that I have dragged in the values section of the pivot table. Total revenue, cost, profit, percentage, cost percentage, and things like that. Now at the moment, this doesn't really look like a profit and loss statement, because the profit and loss statement runs from top to bottom, and I would want some sort of close representation of the profit and loss statement to appear inside of the pivot table. I technically want to take all of these calculations which are there in the columns at the moment, and I would like to display these calculations in the rows instead. That means revenue right here, cost right here, revenue minus cost is profit, then profit percentage, cost percentage, and things like that. That's how my pivot table should flow. I'm going to go ahead in the pivot table field list. At the moment, you can see that the sigma values is there in the columns section of the pivot table. I am going to, however, drag that in the rows section of the pivot table, and all the calculations are there now in the rows section of the pivot table, giving it like a profit and loss statement kind of flow. So you can take a look. We start with revenue, cost, and you have the cost percentage, profit, and the profit percentage. That is pretty awesome. Trick number 6, adding financial years and quarters to your pivot table. A lot of times you're going to work under accounting scenarios where you don't really want to present your data from a standard Jan to December, and you have a custom way of presenting the data. For example, we in India present our data from April through March, and you could have a different way of presenting it. Now, the way to do that is that a standard pivot table cannot really accommodate for any other financial calendar. So it always starts with Jan, always goes up till December. For that, you can add 2 simple columns in your source data. So I'm just going to go over to my source data right here. In the source data, I'm going to add 2 columns. One column is going to be my financial year, and the other column is going to be my financial quarter, FQ and FY. Now, what formula do I write in here? Now, I have made this very simple formula right here, and that formula gives me the financial quarter. I can just copy that one first, Control C, and come back and paste that in my Excel right here. Now, in this formula, the only part that you would want to alter is this date placeholder right here. It is asking you that what is your date against which you would like to calculate your financial quarter. I will replace that date with the actual date that I have, commit to the formula, press enter, and I now have the financial quarter as per the Indian fiscal year standards. That means April and the following 3 months are Q1, so on and so forth. Now, in case you would want to accommodate for this, you can just change this 3 right here to any other number. So in case your year starts with maybe July, so you can have this ending 6, which is number 6, the month of June, and this is going to be starting with the July month, so on and so forth. So you play around with the formula and you should be able to accommodate this as per your own financial year. Let's just do for the financial year as well. So I'm just going to go back to the sheet, get that formula as well. Just Control C on that, come back to Excel and maybe paste that right here. Of course, there is a date placeholder, and I'm going to quickly replace that. Press enter, and that is the financial year that we have. Now, that is pretty awesome. Of course, once you have the formula, you can customize the formula the way that you like. But now that we have the financial year and the quarters created within the data, I can go back to my data set and have that refresh. So I'm just going to right click and say refresh, and instead use my financial year and my financial quarter to present the data rather than my standard year and the month coming from the date grouping in the pivot table. And that is pretty awesome. Pivot table trick number 7, showing text in the values section of the pivot table. If you have not seen this before, this is going to completely blow your mind out. Take a look. So I have the simple pivot table: years, customers, region, total revenue, and the count of the sales rep. Now, you understand that in case you drag anything in the values section of the pivot table, the output is always going to be a numeric output. It can be a sum, it can be an average, account, whatever that might be, but the answer is always going to be numbers. Let's just say you want to change that behavior of the pivot table, and instead you would want to show the names of the sales rep. So here is what I'm trying to do. I want to see that for Boston Consultants in the region of East, show me the names of these 2 sales reps. Who were they? Like, just display the text. Sure enough, what you can do is you can drag the names of the sales rep from here in the row section underneath right here, underneath the region, and you would be able to take a look at the sales rep right here. But what I would want to do is, I do not really want to split the revenue against these 2 sales rep. I want to concatenate them, and I want to take a look at the names of those 2 sales rep right here. Like James, Jaspreet is what I would want to take a look at. How do I do that kind of behavior in a pivot table? So take a look. So I'm going to be using Power Pivot for that and a bit of DAX formulas for that. I'm going to try to make it very, very simple for you. So once you have made the pivot table, you can just click on more tables to load the data of the pivot table in something called like a data model in Power Pivot or in Excel. Now let's just take a look. So I'm just going to click on more tables. It says, do you want to make a new pivot table? Sure enough, yes, I want to make a new pivot table. And the new pivot table is going to be made of using Power Pivot. I click on yes. A same pivot table gets created right here. The format is a bit different, but that's okay. The same pivot table gets created, and this pivot table is made of Power Pivot, which gives you additional abilities to write DAX formulas that can give you some extremely good capabilities in the pivot table. So let's just take a look. So I'm just going to go over to the data tab and I'm going to add a measure. Measure is like the modern calculated fields that you might have created in the past. So it gives you the whole formula library for that. I'm going to say, hey, names of customers, names of sales rep actually. And the formula that I'm going to use is something like a concatenate X, because I'm trying to concatenate multiple sales names together. And it says, hey, the name of the table is nothing but my table right here, which is nothing but data. So I am just going to write the name of the table data. And in fact, I'm just trying to work with one column of the data, which is nothing but the sales rep. So which might also have duplicates. So I'm just going to remove the duplicates from there. So I'm going to say values of the data and square bracket. I'm going to say, hey, this is the sales rep column, close the bracket. And then I'm trying to concatenate the sales rep itself. So I'm just going to copy that column, Control C and Control V on that. And then I'm going to say, hey, the separation is going to be by a comma. I hope that formula should work. Let's just go test that DAX function. That is incomplete. Let's just take a look. There's an extra bracket in there. Check. This is all good. Now, I would not really talk about the DAX right here because that is going to be a completely multiple hour training altogether. But in case you want to take a look at or understand DAX a bit, I would leave a link to a couple of webinars that I have done in the past, and that should give you a good introduction to DAX. Any which ways, click on this. Are we good to go? Here is a pattern. You can copy paste that pattern, click on OK, and that formula gets added right here. Now, if I add that to my pivot table, what I'm going to get is the names of all the sales rep who were there. Now, at the moment, year is missing. So if I could just add the year as well, which is nothing but my date year. And let's just remove the quarter, remove the month. And that is the pivot table, which is where the two names got concatenated, James and Jaspreet. Pretty awesome. Trick number 8, set the default design layout of the pivot table. In the last video that we discussed, we talked about the layout of the pivot table. Here we're going to talk about the design, the look and feel, the colors, the aesthetic appeal of the pivot table. How can you default to that? So first off, if you would like to pick up some standard designs, you can just go to the design tab and pick up all of these standard designs that you have. There are a couple of designs available, anything that you like. But in case you are more of like a designer and you would want some custom styles that you would want to have, you can also make a new pivot table style and design your own style. It gives you a lot of options to design the way your pivot table looks for every possible element of the pivot table. Now, once you have designed that, that design is going to start to appear in the design style right here. And then what you can do is apply that particular design by clicking on it. For example, I'm just going to maybe apply this particular design. Now, once this design is applied in the current Excel that you're working on, all of the future pivot tables that you're going to create are now going to be created in this design only if you right click on that and convert that as a default design. Now, this is only going to be done for the existing file, and that is pretty awesome. Trick number 9, which is going to be one of my favorite tricks. What I do is I change the layout of the field list that appears in the pivot table. So when you get a pivot table, generally the field list that you get appears something like this. So you would have a list of field and there are 4 quadrants at the bottom, which is where you can drag the items from here to rows, columns, values, or wherever you'd like to drag. That's how it appears by default. However, in my field list, I have changed the look and feel of the pivot table field list. I click on the gear icon and I have picked up the second one, which is one that I really like. What this allows me to do is, in case my pivot table field is very, very long and I have a long list of columns that I'd like to scroll through and search through, then I get all the list of the columns their own space. And then from here on, I can drag it to filters, columns, rows, or values. And I really like this one. Trick number 10, merge and center the labels. Take a look. Simple pivot table, financial year, customer, and the revenue. And I do not really want to spill down the financial year across the cells. I, however, would like to merge this cell into a single cell and have 2004 appear in the center of the pivot table. How do I do that? I'm just going to right click on this particular pivot table, in fact, anywhere on the pivot table, and I'm going to go to pivot table options. Once I go there, I have this beautiful option of merge and center that I can click on to merge all the labels and put them in the center, and that appears like that. Now, this can be a handy option in case you'd like to merge but don't really spill down all the values. Alright, that's been it. Those were my 20 awesome pivot table tricks. I hope you like them. And in case you haven't really taken a look at the past 10 pivot table tricks that I have made earlier, I highly recommend that you take a look at that video as well. A lot of people enjoyed watching that video as well. Thanks so much for watching this. And in case you have any questions around this, please feel free to drop in a comment and I would be glad to reply. In the end, a big shout out about my DAX and my Power Query training courses in case you are a beginner trying to get your head around Power BI and get started with Power BI, and you would want to understand the fundamentals really well, which is Power Query, DAX, and data modeling. I'd highly encourage that you take a look at my courses. It's going to be super awesome. Thanks so much for sticking all around throughout the series of these 2 pivot table trick videos. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. Thanks so much for watching this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye now.